The night started the way all Grammy after-parties started in 1988. Too much money in one room, too much ego, too many people pretending they weren't watching each other. The Beverly Hilton ballroom was packed with the kind of crowd that only exists one night a year. Producers with open bars on the labels tab, artists who had just won and artists who hadn't, journalists moving through the room like they belonged there. The champagne was cold. The music was loud enough to feel important, but quiet enough to ignore. Keith Richards was in the corner. He wasn't hiding. Keith Richards never hid. He was just doing what Keith Richards did at parties, standing slightly sideways to the room, a drink in one hand, a cigarette in the other, surveying everything with those heavy-lidded eyes that had seen too much to be impressed by any of it. He was 44 years old and had already outlived three versions of himself. Someone near him, a label executive, the kind who wore an expensive suit but somehow still looked cheap, made a joke about the pop acts nominated that year. Too commercial, too manufactured. The conversation drifted the way conversations do when nobody wants to be the one to say the quiet part loud. Keith said it. "Real music needs guitars," he said, not to anyone in particular. You strip everything back, no instrument, just a voice. That's not music. That's karaoke. The people around him laughed. You don't push back on a man who has been making music longer than most people in that room had been alive. You nod, you smile, you let the moment pass. What nobody noticed was who was sitting 12 feet away. Whitney Houston had been at this party for 40 minutes, and she already wanted to leave. She was 24 years old, 18 months removed from a debut album that had sold 15 million copies, and she was exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't fix. Tonight she was wearing a gown that someone had chosen for her and smiling at people whose names she kept forgetting, trying to remember the last time she'd been in a room simply because she wanted to be there. She heard Keith. She didn't turn her head. She didn't react visibly. She just heard it, and something behind her eyes went very still. The woman sitting next to her, a backup singer named Carol who had known Whitney since she was singing in the choir at New Hope Baptist Church in Newark, saw Whitney's expression change. Not dramatically, not in a way the room could read. Just a quiet shift, like a door closing somewhere deep inside a house you thought you knew well. "You okay?" Carol asked. "He said that loud enough for people to hear," Whitney said. Her voice was even, almost too even. Carol glanced across the room at Keith, still talking, still holding court, completely unaware. "Don't," Carol said. "I'm not going to do anything," Whitney said. And for about 3 minutes, she didn't. She sat there, took a sip of her drink, and looked at the room the way she'd been taught to look at rooms. Pleasantly, neutrally, in a way that gave nothing away. Sissy Houston had raised her daughter to keep her fire on the inside. The church had taught her the same. You don't show people what they've hit, you wait. But here is the thing about growing up the way Whitney Houston grew up. Being the daughter of Sissy Houston and the goddaughter of Aretha Franklin and spending your childhood in the pews of a Baptist church where music wasn't background noise but the whole entire point. You don't think of your voice the way other people think of theirs. You don't think of it as a talent or a skill. You think of it as the thing God gave you instead of an explanation. The one place in the world where you are completely and entirely yourself. Keith Richards had just called it karaoke. Whitney set her glass down on the table, gently, without a sound. She didn't make a scene. She didn't walk across the room or say his name or announce a single thing. She just stood up, slowly, in the middle of that crowded Beverly Hilton ballroom, and she opened her mouth and she sang. It was a gospel melody, not a song from her album. Something older than that. The kind of melody that doesn't have a title because it was never written down. Passed from one voice to another across generations of people who needed it. The melody her mother had sung. The melody she had learned standing next to Aretha as a child. Listening to what a human voice could do when it stopped performing and started telling the truth. She sang it quietly at first, then she didn't. The thing about a voice like Whitney Houston's is that it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't clear its throat or ask for your attention. It just arrives. One moment the room is full of party noise, glasses clinking, conversations stacking on top of each other. someone's hit single coming through the sound system. And then something else is happening, and your body knows before your brain does. And you turn around because some part of you, older than your conscious mind, recognizes what it's hearing. People turned, not all at once. First the people closest to her, then the people near them. The silence moved through the room like a wave, spreading outward from where Whitney was standing, table by table, cluster by cluster, until the only sound in the Beverly Hilton ballroom was her voice. She held a note. She held it the way you hold something precious and terrifying at the same time, like something that took everything you had to reach, and now that you're there, you don't want to come back down. Because coming back down means returning to the world where people get to have opinions about whether what you can do counts as music. She held it and bent it and stretched it somewhere that didn't have a name, somewhere between a church and a challenge. And then she came back down, and the note resolved, and the room felt rearranged without anyone having moved. 30 seconds, maybe a little more. The Beverly Hilton ballroom was completely silent. Keith Richards had stopped talking mid-sentence. He was standing with his drink still in his hand, looking at her, and his expression was not the expression of a man who had just been proven wrong. It was something more complicated than that. It was the expression of a man who had spent 30 years believing he knew exactly what music required and had just heard something that didn't fit inside that belief. Something simply larger than the box he had built for it. Someone in the room started clapping, then someone else, then the whole room, and it wasn't the polished diplomatic applause of an industry event. It was the involuntary kind, the kind your hands do before your head catches up. Whitney didn't bow. She didn't smile at the room or take a moment to absorb what had just happened. She sat back down, picked up her glass, looked at Carol, and said very quietly, "I want to go home." They left 20 minutes later. Nobody wrote about it the next day. No cameras, no reporters with recorders running. The Grammy after party was one of those rooms where what happened stayed there, because everyone had reasons for keeping their cards close. But the people in that ballroom carried it with them the way you carry something that rearranges how you understand an idea you thought you had figured out long ago. A session musician who had worked with both camps talked about it once in a trade interview. Almost nobody read. He said when Whitney started singing, he thought something was wrong with the sound system. Because the idea that a human being could produce that sound in the middle of a cocktail party, no warm-up, no microphone, no scaffolding, it didn't compute. It was like watching someone lift something that shouldn't be liftable, he said. You see it happen, and you still don't quite believe it. Keith Richards gave an interview to a major music magazine in 1993. The journalist asked about vocalists he respected. He named a few: Tina Turner, Solomon Burke, blues singers from the 50s. Then he paused and said, "And Whitney Houston, obviously." The journalist noted it seemed like an unexpected addition. Keith took a slow drag of his cigarette. "Voices are instruments," he said. "I forgot that for a while. Someone reminded me." He didn't say who. He didn't say when. He moved on to the next question like it was nothing. But here is what nobody asked Keith Richards in that interview. The question nobody outside that Beverly Hilton ballroom had the information to ask. When did you forget it? When did you, a man who had spent his whole life arguing that music was about feeling and not technique, look at a 24-year-old woman from Newark and quietly decide she hadn't earned her place in the room? Because the truth, the part that gets smoothed over when people talk about Whitney Houston, is that she spent her entire career fighting exactly that presumption. Not loudly, not publicly, but constantly. From the moment she walked into this industry as a teenager, she was handed a version of herself that somebody else had designed. Too black for some radio stations and not black enough for others. Too gospel for pop and too pop for gospel. The music industry is very good at finding reasons why someone doesn't quite belong, and it had a seemingly endless supply of them for Whitney Houston. What Keith said that night, she had heard versions of it her whole life. Different words, different rooms, different faces delivering the same message. That what she did wasn't serious. That a voice without an instrument was decoration rather than architecture. That the thing she had been given wasn't enough on its own to count. She answered it the same way every time. She opened her mouth. The night of the 1988 Grammy after party, Whitney Houston was 24 years old and already carrying a weight that most people don't accumulate in a lifetime. She was carrying her mother's expectations, the church's standards, the demands of an industry that had decided who she was before she had finished deciding for herself. She walked into that ballroom already tired. She walked out having silenced it. That is the thing about Whitney Houston that people still reach for and can't quite hold on to. The voice was never separate from who she was. It wasn't a product she delivered. It was the most honest version of herself. The version that came directly from those Saturday mornings in New Hope Baptist Church. Her mother's voice in one ear and something larger than both of them moving through the room. When she sang in that ballroom, she wasn't performing. She was telling the truth. And sometimes the truth is so undeniable and so much larger than any argument that it stops a room full of the most powerful people in music cold. It stops a man who has been playing guitar for 30 years mid-sentence. It makes people's hands move without their permission. There are people who were in that room on the night of the 1988 Grammy after party who still think about it. Quietly, the way you think about something that rearranged a small piece of how you understood the world. They say the silence that fell over that ballroom felt different from any other silence they'd ever experienced. Not like a pause, more like an arrival. Music has always done that when it is honest enough. It finds you wherever you are standing and makes you understand, without asking permission, that you were wrong about something you thought you had figured out a long time ago. Whitney Houston did that to a room full of the most powerful, most certain people in the music industry on a February night in 1988. She did it with nothing but her voice. No guitar required. Have you ever felt the crushing weight of everyone's expectations, only to silence them with your true gift? Tell us your story in the comments below.